gold standard for the oil standard. And the Saudis and others create the so-called petrodollar complex, which anchors the dollar. And then the Saudis and other oil monarchies, begin to see their power flourish. Even before that, they were using petrodollars to spread their version of Islam as a counter to Arab nationalism. They feared Arab nationalism, quite rightly so. So the second great process in the Arab world was the rise and consolidation of monarchies. And because of the strength of Saudi Arabia, it was able to defend monarchies such as Morocco. It was able to finance the Moroccans. The small principalities themselves were oil nations, but even the weaker ones, like Bahrain, was essentially underwritten by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia anchors the monarchies, including Jordan. It is the basic bank of monarchical power. And Saudi Arabia, until the Iranian Revolution, had a very close relationship with the Shah of Iran. They liked the Iranians in those days. It's not true this is a Shia-Sunni split. I'll come back to that later. They liked the Iranians because they had a king. They had the Shah of Iran. They didn't have a problem with Shiism. They have a problem with republicanism. That's the key thing. You can't mistake the two. So the second big advantage or change in the region is the rise of monarchical power. The third point, first point was the decline of republican tradition of Arab nationalism. Second point is the rise of monarchical power underwritten or financed by petrodollars, what are known as petrodollars, the petrodollar complex, oil anchoring the dollar, and the Saudis then really supporting monarchical power across the Arab world. The third point is how imperialism enters to tilt the balance in favor of monarchical power, to use military force against any republican tradition that tried to settle accounts with monarchies. Now, this is very, very important and interesting to understand. You see, when the Iranian Revolution took place in 1979, it appeared to be a mass revolution, which it was. There were all kinds of political forces there. Nobody could consolidate power. The left failed to consolidate power. When Ayatollah Khomeini returned from his exile in France, he was greeted like a hero. It was impossible at the point to contest the power of Islamism, that sort of peculiar kind of Iranian Islamism. Very difficult to contest that. The left had no way to contest it. And so it becomes an Islamic republic. They don't have a king. It's a democracy. This was anathema to the Saudis, particularly because they had felt that Egyptian republicanism, which had led the charge against monarchy in the region, had been basically killed off by 1979, when Anwar al-Sadat made peace with the Saudis and made peace with Israel, the first Arab state to recognize Israel in 1979. When Anwar al-Sadat had effectively put his republican sword on the ground and bowed to the monarchs, then there was a revolution in Iran where the Iranians said, wait a minute, we are against monarchy on both doctrinal grounds. Shiism doesn't like monarchs, and on political grounds. We don't want the Saudis to exercise monarchical power in the region. So this sets off the first big challenge for the Republican states. The Iraqis under Saddam Hussein are paid by the West and by the Saudis to attack Iran in 1980. And so Saddam takes Iraq's Republican tradition and puts it at the service of imperialism. That's what Saddam does. And in fact, that war that goes from 1980 to 1988 wipes out a lot of the great, impact of republicanism, wipes out that tradition. It's a serious blow to the Republican tradition. Then the United States pivots I mean, it's dangerous to be an ally of the US because Iraq was an ally from 1980 to 1988, but the US pivots and the Gulf Arab state pivot and they refuse to pay the last tranches, amounts of money to the Iraqis for the war. And so the Iraqis turn on the Gulf Arab states and Saddam invades Kuwait, and that begins a long cycle of imperialist direct wars to destroy all the remnant, already collapsed Republican tradition, but the remnant Republican states. The attack on Iraq from 1990 to 2003, eventually the overthrow of the Iraqi government. The attack on Syria starts in 2003, ends in 2024 with the downfall of the Assad government. Effective attack on Egypt that starts in the 1950s has already collapsed Egypt in 1979. No need to go further. The attack on Libya, 2011, but actually starts much earlier than that. And Gaddafi makes the quote-unquote error of surrendering to the West in 2003. He surrenders to the West its their nuclear program. And in that surrender, he basically changes the terms of balance, he weakens the situation for the Libyan people to be able to contest imperialism. So you have right from 1979 or 1980, when Iraq starts its war against Iran, you have a direct military intervention by US imperialism to knock out the remnants of Arab nationalism. And the US starts to build up a massive base complex in the Middle East, all in Gulf Arab countries that are subservient to imperialism, you know, from Qatar down to the United Arab Emirates, previously in Saudi Arabia, then they were asked to leave the kingdom on doctrinal religious grounds. Eventually, they have massive naval capacity in both the Mediterranean and around the Persian Gulf area, threatening Iran, threatening any remnant of republicanism. That's the threat. It's this dialectic in the Middle East is between monarchicalism and republicanism. And in that, imperialism takes the side of monarchicalism. That's the third point, okay? So the first point was the collapse of Arab nationalism through capitalist pressure, globalization, and so on. The second is the rise of monarchical power underwritten by oil. The third is how imperialism directly enters after the Iranian Revolution militarily to put paid to remnant or remaining Arab nationalist regimes. Point number 4, Israel. Israel obviously starts its innings in the world in 1948 as a settler colony. Certainly the Jews were persecuted in Europe for hundreds of years, pogroms and so on. And then there was the Holocaust. But the Europeans, rather than coming to terms with their own violence against Jews, exported the so-called Jewish question, a phrase used in Germany, extremely anti-Semitic question, which was asked in Germany, can Jews be German and Jews? The kind of question that Hindutva asks Muslims in India today. It's a ludicrous question. You know, it makes no sense. It's offensive. But that was an actual debate in Germany in the 19th century, in which Marx participated, arguing very much against the terms of that debate as a young man in his essay on the Jewish question. Jews, rather than being settled back in Europe, which would have been their right, were basically outsourced to the Middle East, where they began to take land settled by the Palestinians a long time ago. And the basis of the problem in the Levant, in that region, Palestine, is the entry of European Jews to take Palestinian lands, and eventually in 1948, invalidate the partition agreement and take everything. It would have been as if the Indian army had crossed into what was then Pakistan and said all of this is ours and displaced the Pakistanis into Iran. That's exactly what happens to the Palestinians. There was a partition agreement on the table, and the Israelis said, no, we want it all, and conducted what's known as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Initially, the Arab states around Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, participated in a war in 1948, and then again in 1967, and to some extent in 1973, participated in a war to try to narrow Israel's power, but was not successful. And in 1979, under pressure from imperialism, Egypt surrenders to Israel. In 1994, Jordan surrenders to Israel. In 1994, with the Soviet Union collapsed, the Palestinians effectively conduct a partial surrender through the Oslo Agreement. Only Syria and Lebanon refused to surrender, as it were. The old Arab nationalist traditions intact, but also in Lebanon, an Iranian tradition of republicanism intact with Hezbollah, which is now formed to fight the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. So the Israelis struggle with Syria and Lebanon, also with a section of the Palestinians that refuse to surrender. And in fact, the Intifada, or the uprising that starts in 1987, very, very mass popular uprising, is an uprising that rejects what's going to come, which is the Oslo Agreement in 1994. And that Intifada continues till today, the energy of that Intifada. Palestinian people actually have refused the surrender. They've refused the terms of the Palestinian Authority, which gives credence to Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, because they were all rejectionists. They rejected Oslo. Very important, they rejected the terms of Oslo. So their popularity increases. The left more in the West Bank and Hamas more in Gaza, the occupied territories. Israel has been trying to vanquish this resistance completely. In this, the collapse of Arab nationalism has meant that Iran has played a central role in defending the Palestinian resistance. And for Iran, Syria was important and Libya was important. In the current genocide, Israel has destroyed a section of the Palestinian resistance with its extreme violence. It has destroyed a section of the Lebanese resistance, particularly with the assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. And it has destroyed any possibility of resistance from Syria because it backed the entry of Al-Qaeda's Ahmad al-Sharra to become the interim president of Syria. And Ahmad al-Sharra immediately expelled leadership of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad from Damascus, and arrested some Islamic Jihad members in Damascus. So Israel, with imperialism, is trying to extinguish any resistance to imperialist domination of the region, including monarchical domination of the region. They want to extinguish Arab republicanism, which is partly why they are going after is Iran, because Iran, even though not an Arab country, is a standard bearer for republicanism. And the Palestinians are a symbol of that republicanism and national liberation. This they want to extinguish. So, my friends, these are the 5 points which I presented to you to try to explain a little bit of the context of the Arab world in general, including Iran, and why this genocide is continuing and why Egypt and Jordan and others haven't decided to just cross the border and try to defend Palestinians who are dying in the tens of thousands. Thanks a lot.
We have a little more time, Vijay, but this means there's more time for questions. I will now take the liberty of summarizing your presentation in Tamil, which gives you some time to reflect and do whatever else you want to do. Although I wouldn't be surprised if you knew Tamil also. So we'll go to the Tamil section of the presentation for a few minutes. Hopefully Vijay will not find too much wrong with my Tamil translation. The 5 points around which விஜய் என்ன பண்ணாருன்னா ஒரு 5 முக்கிய அம்சங்களை சுற்றி அவருடைய உரையை அமைச்சுக்கிட்டார். இப்போ என்ன கான்டெக்ட் பேசிட்டு இருக்கிறோம், இஸ்ரேல் இருந்து அன்றாடம் பல்லாயிரக்கணக்கான பாலஸ்தீன மக்களை, நிராயுதபாணியான மக்களை, குழந்தைகளை கொன்று குவிக்கிறது. இது இதை எதிர்த்து குரல்களே கூட உலகத்துல வலுவாக ஒலிக்கல என்று நாம் கவலைப்படுகின்ற அளவுக்கு நிலைமை இருக்கு. அப்போ இந்த மாதிரி மக்கள் கொல்லப்படுறாங்க அப்படின்னு சொன்னா அவர் சொன்னாரு, ஒரு இஸ்ரேல் இந்த கொலை நடத்தக்கூடிய இடத்துல குழந்தைகள் எப்படி சஃபர் பண்றாங்க, எப்படி வேஸ்டிங், அவங்களுடைய உணவு இல்லாம அவங்க செத்துட்டு இருக்கிறாங்க, மக்கள் செத்துட்டு இருக்கிறாங்க, உணவு இல்லாம ஜேர்னலிஸ்ட் எல்லாருமே அப்படி சந்திக்க வேண்டியிருக்கு. இப்போ அது விரைவில் விஜயினுடைய ஒரு காலம் வரும், அவுட்லுக்ல ஒரு காலம் எழுத போறாரு. அதுல இந்த பிரச்சனைகளை பற்றி கொஞ்சம் விரிவா பேசுவாரு, அவசியம் படிங்க. இந்திய அரசு இதுல முழுக்க முழுக்க இஸ்ரேலோட மானுட படுகொலையை எதிர்க்க முன்வரவில்லை என்பது மிகவும் கண்டிக்கத்தக்க ஒரு நிலை. அண்மையில கூட CPIM தலைமையிலான சில சக்திகள் மும்பை நகரத்துல இஸ்ரேலுடைய கொலைவெறியை எதிர்த்து ஒரு நிகழ்ச்சி நடத்துறதுக்கு கூட இந்திய அரசு அவங்களுக்கு அனுமதி வழங்கலை, மும்பையில் அனுமதி வழங்கப்படலை என்பதையும் குறிப்பிடணும். இப்போ சொல்லக்கூடிய 5 முக்கியமான அம்சங்கள் என்ன அப்படின்னு சொன்னா, ஒன்று, கடந்த ஒரு 5-10 ஆண்டுகள்ல, 2ஆம் உலகப் போர் முடிந்து நம்ம பார்த்துருக்கோம் இல்லையா, அந்த காலகட்டத்தில் கிட்டத்தட்ட அரபு தேசியம் 50கள் வலுவா இருந்துச்சு, அணிசர இயக்கத்துக்குள்ள பகுதியாகவும் இருந்துச்சு. ஆனா அந்த அரபு தேசியம் என்பது இன்றைக்கு முழுமையாக அழிக்கப்பட்டிருக்கு அப்படிங்கிறத நம்ம பார்க்கணும். இதுல ஒரு முக்கியமான பங்களிப்பு செய்தது சவுதி அரேபியா. அப்கோர்ஸ் ஏகாதிபத்தியமும் அதுல பின்னிருந்து பணியாற்றியது. இரண்டாவது, அரபு தேசியம் ஏன் இப்படி தோல்வி அடைஞ்சது என்று கேட்டா, ஏகாதிபத்தியத்தினுடைய பங்களிப்பு மட்டும் இல்லை, அந்த நாட்டு மக்களுடைய தேவைகளை எதிர்கொள்வதற்கு அவங்களால முடியல, ஒரு குறைந்தபட்ச சமூக நல அரசை அவங்களால அமைக்க முடியல. இதே தான் இந்தியாவில் நம்ம பார்க்குறோம். விடுதலைக்கு பிறகு காங்கிரஸ் கட்சியோ அல்லது லோகியா சோஷலிஸ்டுகளோ அவங்களால தொடர்ந்து விடுதலை போராட்டத்தில் செய்த கமிட்மெண்ட்ஸை நிறைவேற்ற முடியல. அப்போ இந்த சமூக ஜனநாயக அரசுகளால் தொடர்வதில் சிக்கல்கள் வருது என்பதை அவர் குறிப்பிட்டார். இதுக்கு பிறகு இந்த வளர்ச்சி பாதையில் போகும்பொழுது, அது வெதர் ஈஜிப்டா இருக்கட்டும் அல்லது இந்தியா இருக்கட்டும், இந்த வளர்ச்சி பாதையில கடன் வாங்குற பிரச்சனை வருது, உலக வங்கி IMF தலையீடு வருது, தாராளமய கொள்கைகள் உலகம் புறா வரும்பொழுது, இது அரபு தேசியத்தினுடைய சரிவுக்கு, அழிவுக்கு அது முக்கியமான பங்காற்றுது. இந்தியாவில் மட்டுமல்ல, உலகம் முழுவதுமே நவீன தாராளமயத்தினுடைய தாக்குதலை நம்ம பார்க்குறோம். இப்போ இந்த அரபு தேசியத்தினுடைய பலவீனம் என்பதை ஒரு உலக அளவில் முதலாளித்துவ வளர்ச்சியினுடைய விளைவுகள் என்ன என்பதோட நினைச்சு பார்க்க வேண்டியிருக்கு. கிட்டத்தட்ட இதனுடைய பேரலா மொனார்கி அரசு, மன்னராட்சி காலமாக அரபு நாடுகளில் பலதும் எமர்ஜ் ஆகுது, முன்பு இல்லாத ஒரு அம்சம். அதுல அரபு தேசியம் பலவீனமுடைய மன்னராட்சி என்பது தலை தூக்குது. அதுல ஏகாதிபத்தியம் இந்த வாய்ப்பை பயன்படுத்தி கொண்டு அங்க இருக்கக்கூடிய வர்க்க பலாபலங்களை, சக்திகளின் பலாபலங்களை மன்னர்கள் சார்பாக மாற்றுது. இதுக்கு மத்தியில் தான் இதுக்கு ஒரு எதிர்நிலையாகத்தான் ஈரான் புரட்சி என்பது வருகிறது 1979. ஏற்கனவே 1953 ஈரானுடைய ஆட்சி கவிழ்த்தவங்க அமெரிக்கன்ஸ், ஷா ஈரானை கொண்டு உட்காத்தி வச்சவங்க. ஆனால் 79 அந்த ரிஜிம் தோற்கடிக்கப்படுது, மக்கள் எழுச்சியில ஈரான் புரட்சி நிகழ்கிறது. அந்த ஈரான் புரட்சி ஒரு இஸ்லாமிய குடியரசு அமைக்குது. அப்போ அவங்க மதம் சார்ந்தவர்கள் அல்ல, அவங்க முக்கியமாக குடியரசு விழுமியங்களை ஓரளவு ஏற்றுக்கொள்ளக்கூடிய ஒரு அமைப்பு இதுதான் ஈரான் ரெவல்யூஷன் என்பதை நம்ம குறிப்பா பார்க்கணும். இதற்கு இந்த காலகட்டத்தில் தான் ஈரானை பலவீனப்படுத்த அமெரிக்க ஏகாதிபத்தியம் சதாமை பயன்படுத்துகிறது. சதாம் ஹுசேன் ஈராக்கில் வந்து 1980 ஈரானோட ஒரு போரை துவக்கி 8 ஆண்டுகள் இந்த போர் நடந்து ஈரானும் பலவீனம் அடையுது, ஈராக்கும் பலவீனம் அடையுது. அப்போ இந்த பேக்ரவுண்டையும் நம்ம வந்து நிகழ்வுகளில் கணக்கில் எடுத்துக்கொள்ளணும். இப்போ இந்த காலகட்டத்தில் தான் உங்களுக்கு வந்து எண்ணெய் விலை ஏறி அதை பயன்படுத்தி இந்த மொனார்க்கிகள் அரசு மன்னராட்சிகள் தங்களை பலப்படுத்தி கொண்டாங்க. பிறகு ஈரானை பொறுத்தவரையில் இந்த ஷா தூக்கி எறியப்பட்டாலும் அது அங்கே ஒரு குடியரசு தன்மை இருக்கு. பட் அவங்க வந்து மற்ற விஷயங்கள்ல ஏகாதிபத்தியத்துல எல்லாம் அவ்வளோவா வலுவாக எடுக்கலை. அவங்க ஒரு ஏகாதிபத்தியாக தொடர்றாங்க இன்னைக்கும். லிபியா என்பது ஒரு கட்டம் வரைக்கும் மேலை நாடுகளை எதிர்த்து பின்னாடி சரண்டர் ஆகிடுறாங்க 2003 பிறகு அப்படிங்கிறத அவர் சொல்கிறாரு. அப்புறம் அமெரிக்கா இந்த காலகட்டத்தை முழுக்க பயன்படுத்தி மேற்காசிய பகுதிகளில், கல்ஃப் நாடுகளில் எல்லா இடங்களிலும் அமெரிக்கா தன்னுடைய இராணுவ தளத்தை உருவாக்கி கொள்கிறது. கிட்டத்தட்ட அமெரிக்காவுடைய அனுமதி இல்லாமல் எதுவுமே செய்ய முடியாதுன்ற ஒரு நிலையை அங்கே ஏற்படுத்துது என்பதை நம்ம அந்த ஏகத்தினுடைய பிடி வலுக்குது. அதுவும் மன்னராட்சிகளில் இணைந்து செயல்படக்கூடிய ஒரு மிகவும் பிற்போக்கான காட்சியை நம்ம வந்து அந்த நாடுகளை பார்க்க முடியுது. அப்போ இந்த பாயிண்ட்ஸ், டிக்ளைன் ஆஃப் அரபு நேஷனலிசம், அரபு தேசியம் பலவீனம் அடைவது, மன்னராட்சி முன்னுக்கு வருவது, அதில் எண்ணெய் வளங்களும் ஒரு பங்காற்றுகின்றன. அமெரிக்கா தலையிடுகிறது மன்னராட்சிக்கு ஆதரவாக அப்படிங்கிறதும் அதில் இருக்கு. சிரியா, லெபனான் போன்ற நாடுகள் வந்து அப்படி சரண்டர் ஆகலை. ஆனால் அங்கே ஓரளவு அவங்க வந்து ரெசிஸ்ட் பண்ணுறாங்க. ஆனால் அங்கே கூட ஜோர்டான், ஈஜிப்ட் இவங்கெல்லாம் வந்து சரண்டர் ஆகிடுறாங்க. பட் அதனால தான் இன்றைக்கி பார்த்தீங்கன்னா இந்த அட்டாக், இஸ்ரேல் அமெரிக்காவுடைய அட்டாக் பிரதானமாக சிரியா, லெபனான், பாலஸ்தீன மக்கள் இவர்களுக்கு எதிராக மையமாக இருக்கிறது. அப்கோர்ஸ் ஈரான் பிரதான எதிரி அவங்களுக்கு. ஒரு பகுதி பாலஸ்தீன மக்கள் வந்து இந்த ஆஸ்லோ ஒப்பந்தங்களில் சரண்டர் ஆகிடுறாங்க. அமெரிக்க வல்லரசனுடைய சதிகளுக்கு இரையாகி ஒரு ஒப்பந்தம் போடுறாங்க இஸ்ரேலோட. ஆனால் ஒரு பகுதி பாலஸ்தீனிய மக்கள் வந்து தொடர்ந்து போராடுறாங்க. அதான் இன்டிஃபாடான்னு சொல்லி 1987 பிறகு அங்கே வரக்கூடிய மக்களுடைய போராட்டங்கள் வெடிக்குது. அதில் வந்து ஹமாஸ், இஸ்லாமிக் ஜிஹாட் மட்டுமின்றி பிஎஃப்எல்பி, பாப்புலர் ஃப்ரண்ட் ஃபார் தி லிபரேஷன் ஆஃப் பாலஸ்தீன், பாலஸ்தீன் விடுதலைக்கான பாப்புலர் முன்னணி, இது போன்ற சக்திகள், ஒரு ஜனநாயக சக்திகள் முன்னுக்கு வர்றாங்க. இஸ்ரேல் வந்து ஒட்டுமொத்தமாக அரபு தேசியத்தை அழிக்கணும் என்ற பாதையில் அது பயணிக்குது. இந்த நிலவையில் இன்னைக்கு மீண்டும் ஜனநாயகத்தை ஒன்றுபடுத்தி ஏகாதிபத்தை எதிர்த்து ஒரு வலுவான மாற்றை நம்ம உருவாக்க வேண்டியிருக்கு. அந்த சவால் நம்ம முன்னாடி இருக்கு. அது அவ்வளவு எளிதல்ல, இருந்தாலும் காலத்தின் கட்டாயம் அதை நோக்கி நாம் பயணிக்க வேண்டும். ஆகவே இன்றைக்கு நாம் காண்கின்ற நிகழ்வுகளுக்கு ஒரு பின்புலம் இருக்கு. ஏகாதிபத்தினுடைய வர்க்க நலன் இருக்கு, மன்னர் ஆட்சியினுடைய வர்க்க தன்மை இருக்கு. இதெல்லாம் எதிர்த்து ஜனநாயகங்களை ஒன்றிணைத்து போராட வேண்டிய ஒரு சவால் நம்ம முன்னாடி இருக்கு என்று நம்ம அவர் சொன்னதை புரிஞ்சுக்கலாம். இன்னும் நிறைய விஷயங்கள் அவர் பேசியிருக்கிறாரு. நான் ரொம்ப சுருக்கமாக தான் உங்களுக்கு கொடுத்துருக்கேன். பல கேள்விகள் வந்திருக்கு. We can go to the questions now. Several questions have been raised. So I will just read them out for Vijay's sake. Some of them are in Tamil, but I'll read them out in English also. One question that has come is, some people seem to think that China is silent on Israel's genocidal activities. Is that so? And why is it so, if it is so? ரெண்டாவது வந்து, during Vietnam War, there was a global anti-imperialist movement. வியட்நாம் யுத்தத்தின் பொழுது உலக அளவில் எழுந்த ஏகாதிபத்திய எழுச்சி ஏன் இன்னைக்கு வரல? Why such an anti-imperialist movement is not to be seen, as we had seen during the period of the American war against Vietnam and Indochina? இது ரெண்டாவது கேள்வி. 1, 2. மூணாவது I'll wait. Maybe Vijay can take them on. Are there more questions? There are 2 with me.
Yeah, Vietnam.
I've asked. And then, can the Iranian regime withstand? No. Sorry. Give it me. Sorry. Okay. Can the Iranian regime with its theological underpinnings qualify for the Republican tag? Is one of the comments is asking. That's it. Yeah, I'm not mentioning his name. This is it.
What is the role played by China in combating Israel?
That I will decide. Yeah.
Three questions.
ஆமாம். அப்போ ஈரான் வந்து நம்ம குடியரசுன்னு சொல்லலாமான்னு ஒரு கேட்டிருக்காரு. அங்கே மன்னராட்சி இருக்கே அப்படின்னு. மன்னராட்சி இல்லை, அங்கே ஒரு மதம் சார்ந்த ஆட்சி இருக்கே என்று அவர் கேட்டிருக்கிறார். Go ahead, Vijay, the floor is yours.
Yeah. What excellent questions. Really, this is the reason why I didn't want to take more time, because the questions are always so rich. Okay. Actually, let's take the questions to some extent chronologically. The first is on the Iranian government, and can it, because it's a theocratic state, can it qualify as a republican? Well, it is republican. It doesn't have a king. It's plainly republican. It's against monarchialism.
Elections.
It has elections. It has a parliament. Now, one could say, well, but the senior clerics decide on who can be the candidate. That's true. But in all capitalist democracies, somebody decides who can be the candidate. In India, for instance, it's money. Money decides. I mean, take the case of running for a Lok Sabha seat. If you don't get so many votes, you lose your deposit. So that's a barrier to entry. You're afraid to lose a deposit. And to win an election, it is now very clear you need lots of money. So money is the funnel in an Indian capitalist democracy. We shouldn't be too proud of, well, we are the greatest democracy. All capitalist democracies have a funnel. And in most of them, the funnel is money. In Iran, the funnel is the clergy. But it's still a republican system. It's not a monarchy. There is no absolute monarchy. In fact, the supreme leader, as Ayatollah Khamenei is known, can't just say do this, do that. I mean, there's a parliament, there's a government, and there's actually very intense fights inside Iran about the direction. This is the reason why the media outside describes one section as reformers and the other section as hardliners. Let me ask you, in Saudi Arabia, are there reformers and hardliners? I mean, it's irrelevant. There's the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And what Mohammed bin Salman and his palace say is actually the law of the land. I mean, it's an absolute monarchy. His father has entrusted him with the keys to the kingdom. So it is a republic. It is a theocratic republic. Yes, but not a monarchy. I think one has to make a difference. Now, there are constitutional monarchies in the world, many of them in Europe. The Scandinavian countries, constitutional monarchies, they still have kings and so on. Britain has a king who plays actually a role overseeing parliament. But it is still a constitutional monarchy. They have a constitution, they have a parliament. They have a parliament, they have a constitution, and so on. It's not a sorry, my dogs get excited. It's not a monarchy. I think that's the dividing line. Now, that doesn't mean that one should say that theocratic regimes are a good thing. No, we have our problems with them. But we understand that it's neither a monarchy, nor is it subservient to imperialism. It's playing a very interesting role, Iran is. But of course, it's a theocratic regime. You can have problems with that aspect of it, but that doesn't make it a monarchy. So that's the first question. Very, very good question. The second question is on the Vietnam War. The context of the Vietnam War era is very different than now. The first part of the context is that in the Vietnam War era, there were a lot of US soldiers, Australian soldiers, people from other countries that were part of the Western imperialist bloc actually fighting the war in Vietnam. They were attempting to overthrow a national liberation movement led by initially Ho Chi Minh. Huge, popular support for the Vietnamese struggle. As a consequence, also let it be said, of the character of Ho Chi Minh, the incredible character of Ho Chi Minh himself. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and with the United States attempting to build a unipolar world structure, it's very important. I always argue with people saying, it's not like US built unipolarity, it tried to. but there were lots of standout countries, North Korea, Cuba, and so on, Venezuela, refusing to accept, the suzerainty or sovereignty of the United States over the world. They continued to fight to defend their sovereignty. The US tried to, in this period when the US is the dominant imperialist power and military technology has increased so dramatically, and also communications technology has so decidedly favored big multinational corporations and so on. At this period, in this time, it's been very difficult to maintain clear lines of what's happening in parts of the world. We just sometimes don't know about imperialist actions taking place, whether it's undermining the people in Sudan or undermining the people in Ethiopia. We don't know. There was a border clash yesterday between Cambodia and Thailand, barely reported anywhere in the world. What's happening in Myanmar, where the United States, after the elevation of the Muhammad Yunus government, is attempting to create a so-called humanitarian corridor from Bangladesh into Myanmar, and where they want to use a Japanese-built port to essentially offload weapons for their preferred group in Myanmar because they have a proxy group in Myanmar and so on. It's so messy now. They don't need to land US troops and so on. The whole situation of hybrid war is so messy. It's difficult to have the kind of clarity one had in the Vietnam era. There's an American army and a Vietnamese army. The second thing is the Palestinians suffer from the lack of an identifiable leader. This is an important thing to bear in mind. Yasser Arafat, for all his problems towards the end of his life, functioned as the symbol of Palestinian resistance. When he came to India, Indira Gandhi went to the airport at Palam, walked onto the airfield to greet him, and he called her my sister and so on. Today, there is no identifiable Palestinian leader who unites the Palestinian people in struggle. The Palestinian people are divided between Hamas and the Republican sections, the theocratic and the Republican. Even Hamas is unable to project a leader. Partly they don't want to. They don't want to project a leader. They don't really have leaders of the caliber, of a young Yasser Arafat. And certainly the Republican forces also don't have the capacity. Khalida Jarrar, the great leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, kept being put into jail. She was thrown into prison until very recently, not even given oxygen to breathe and so on. So the second question of why isn't there a global struggle is partly for these two factors, but there's a third factor as well. And this is that as our movements have been drawn into social democratic struggles, you see, with the collapse of, let's say in India, the collapse of social democracy, where the Congress no longer defends the right of people to eat and so on, where the old Loyaite tradition no longer defends the right of people to eat, the communist movement is forced to enter into the space of social democracy because we cannot afford to see people starve to death. So we are fighting for basic wages and things like that. A lot of our revolutionary energy is drawn into social democracy as a consequence of its demise in India. So what I wrote about in the book I did, No Free Left, which actually came out in Tamil as well from Bharatiya Puttakalam, I made the argument that one shouldn't say, well, why is the communist left in India doing this social democratic work? It's because social democracy has collapsed. And as a consequence, our internationalism has weakened. There's not that much space. If you are wrapped up in so much of social democratic work, there is not that much space to build the kind of internationalism that we need to build. In India, for instance, internationalism is decidedly weak, not just around Palestine. But where is our internationalism when it comes to Myanmar, Burma? There's a war going on there. Very little understanding of what's happening there. Even that, our neighboring countries, where is the fight to unite our neighbors? The fight to unite Pakistan and India and so on, unite the peoples. We just don't have the capacity, it seems, for a robust internationalism. And finally, on China. Look, China is a complicated country. For many years, the Chinese government took the position after a very adventurous period when they said, you know, X's revolution is our revolution. They encouraged people to go out there and do the armed struggle. After that period of adventurism in the 1960s and early 70s, after the Cultural Revolution collapsed, China retreated and took the view we don't want to interfere in anybody's internal relations. You know, they really retreated away from any foreign policy intervention. In fact, made quite bad choices in that retreat, very bad choices for a long period. Well, recently the Chinese government has taken an interest in world affairs, partly because of the rise of China. So what they've been able to do is modest. They brought the Iranians and Saudis to Beijing to have a face-to-face meeting, open a channel of dialogue. And very importantly, in the months after the genocide began, they brought the 14 factions of the Palestinians to Beijing for the first time in about 40 years to sit down around a table and talk about building a Palestinian politics. Very important thing the Chinese have done. Now, have they done enough? No, of course not. Why won't they do more? They do not want to, you know, provoke the United States to act against the Chinese. They are afraid of US violence against China. I must say, you know, I follow Chinese politics very closely. And after the India-Pakistan air war, where Chinese technology did pretty well against Western technology, in other words, the Chinese technology used by the Pakistanis, within China, a new confidence has arisen that China can defend itself against the Western attack. But, you know, this is not something that the government is going to immediately absorb and say, let's be more aggressive defending the Palestinians. I mean, they make statements. That's not enough. But really, in a sense, I would ask you, what does one expect somebody to do from halfway around the world when the neighboring countries are absolutely paralyzed?
Thank you, Vijay. We should take on one or two more questions. I have a question, using my privilege as a coordinator. You know, we recognize that imperialism is essential to the existence of Israel. And its genocidal activities are supported broadly, not just by US imperialism, but even by many of the European imperialisms, although they make some different noises from time to time. So we need to place the relationship between US and Israel in a context. I remember that in the late 30s, Mahatma Gandhi said with this brilliant simplicity that Palestine belongs to the Palestinians in the same way as England belongs to the English. But now we have a situation where, you know, this stolen country has been created from out of Palestinian lands. So why does this happen? Why does the US go all out to support Israel and back all its actions, including genocide? That's one question.
Yeah, you know, go ahead. You want me to answer that? Why don't we pick up the others? Yeah, let's pick up the others. Yeah.
Okay. The couple other questions can they're all over the place. So yeah, one question has been, somebody wanted to know what have been the most effective forms of resistance against imperialism in West Asia throughout history, and what lessons can be drawn from those for contemporary struggles. The other question has been raised by one of our young comrades is, over the internet, I see many people supporting, many Israeli people supporting genocide. How Israel is using the media as a psychological weapon to convince its people, how do we tackle it? So enough for the day, I think.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, really, I mean, I'm really happy with the quality of the question, comrades. I mean, no, I'm serious. No, not your question, Venkatesh, because you, of course, are my senior, and I expect a nice hardball question from you. But for my younger comrades, I'm really very impressed, and I want to say that you know, these are thoughtful questions. Okay, and by the way, I'm saying all this to think through how to answer the questions. Okay, so the first question on US imperialism is this very, very fraught question. You know, I've argued with people for years. There's always the debate about the tail and the dog. You know, is the United States the dog and Israel is the tail, or is Israel the dog and the United States the tail? You know, this is the debate. Once I had this discussion with Chomsky, who has his favorite position. I'm not going to reveal it. People should read his work to find it, you know. But my argument was that, look, you know, this is not a dog and a tail. I mean, frankly, they are one and the same in many respects, the United States and Israel. You know, the United States sees Israel as an enormous opportunity. You know, Israel is part of its essentially hub and spoke system to maintain US forward policy in the region. You know, in the same way as for years, the US had used Pakistan as a forward policy into Afghanistan, Central Asia, the underbelly of the USSR, as the United States has used South Korea, you know, as a sort of launch pad, and Japan as a launch pad against the Soviets, and then later against the Chinese and North Koreans. You know, this use of a country, Colombia in South America, was the hub and spoke center for South America. You know, it was the place where the US had its greatest military strength. So, you know, Israel is like a aircraft carrier, or is like a military base for the US at one level. But secondly, it's important to understand that a lot of Israelis have very close ties with the United States. Many come now from the US to become settlers in the West Bank, illegal settlers. Many of them, you know, carry double passports, US Israeli passports, and so on. And they have a constituency in the United States, which is the Christian Zionists. Very large constituency, not just in the United States, in Brazil, even in Chile, where I live, it's the largest Palestinian population outside the Middle East, 500,000 Palestinians. But there's also a large evangelical population, which believes in Christian Zionism, the view that the Jews have to build the second temple on top of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, get rid of the Muslims from there. And when that happens, God will bring Armageddon and bring all the believers up to heaven. I mean, it's the ideology of Christian Zionists, a huge constituency in the United States. It's basically an anti-Semitic idea, because they are saying, let the Jews build the second temple, and then God will kill all the Jews and other heathens and lift up the Christians. A crazy idea. People actually believe all this stuff, and it motivates politics. Absolutely nutty idea. But there it is. Can't contest it. So, Venkatesh, why does the United States support? Well, they have, you know, these geopolitical war aims. There are some of these crazy ideas about Christian Zionism. And I refuse the dog and tail argument and say basically they are one and the same. Israel is like a forward military base of the United States, has to be defended. So that's my very short and blunt answer to the question. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who take the dog tail thing seriously, and they debate that to the death. And I felt, what does it matter really? You know, because frankly, these are people who believe in the mind-body distinction. The dog and the tail are both part of the dog. So what are you trying to argue? You know, the dog doesn't wag the tail. The tail is part of the dog, for God's sake. So I've always found that dog and tail thing to be ridiculous. You know, it's ridiculous even before the metaphor. Okay, second, what forms of resistance? Second should be the Israeli public. This is a very important issue. Just today, a columnist from Haaretz was on BBC radio, and he said something interesting. Columnist for Haaretz, he used to be in the government of Israel. He was ambassador, senior man. He said today that, you know, the Israeli media is not actually telling the Israeli public about what's happening in Palestine. It's basically forbidden. They are building up the line in most of the TV news and so on, all owned by right-wing Zionists. They're building up the line that you know, the Palestinians are brutal and so on, and that Israel is conducting a human or humanitarian war. That's the line that they are building in the media, and which is why over 50% of the population surveyed in Israel say that when the Israeli army takes an area, they should kill all civilians. I mean, it's a brutal survey. It's hideous. Some of this comes from Zionism, which is a decadent ideology, because Zionism is Jewish supremacism. You know, for those who are against Hindu supremacism or Muslim supremacism or Christian supremacism or white supremacism or any supremacism, you must be opposed to Jewish supremacism. It's a form of ethno-religious supremacism. It's a quite a disgusting, decadent ideology, and Zionism has a grip on Israeli society. It needs to be felt. It has to be fought in the same way as in India, Hindutva, which is a Hindu supremacist ideology, has to be fought. So that's a serious problem for Israeli society, which it has to come to grips with. If it wants to be able to build a rational state project alongside the Palestinians. Finally, forms of resistance. You know, this is a question that cannot be answered easily, because this is a question about context. You know, at a certain moment, when the Palestinians formed an armed struggle, the Fedayeen from Lebanon, from Jordan, from Syria would come in, do military attacks. That has got harder and harder to do as a consequence of the repressive apparatus around Israel. Now, that is why I was actually surprised by the events of October 7th, how the Palestinians were able to break the surveillance that the Israelis have. It obviously shows that the Israeli surveillance is not omnipotent. It's not 100% accurate. Even the walk return on 27 January, which the Palestinians conducted, apparently came under the radar of Israeli intelligence. It shows that they are not as infallible as they sometimes claim. But the extreme asymmetry of military power shows you that the armed struggle strategy, while essential for a people being battered as they are, is not actually going to be as important as it perhaps was for the Algerians against the French. The Israelis have enormous advantage militarily from the air. The Algerians also faced French air attacks, but when the Algerians took French lives in Algiers, in the Battle of Algiers, it actually turned the tide. It also helped that in France there was a move against the slaughter in Algeria. Within Israel, the peace movement is almost destroyed. It's almost nothing. So it's very difficult to think what are some of the tactical things. One of the main things I feel is that you need to have a return to a new form of republicanism, of Arab nationalism in the Arab states. That would begin to shift the balance. But sadly, the governments in Egypt, which is actually bought and paid by the Saudis, the governments in Libya, bought and paid by the Gulf Arabs and the Turks. The government in Algeria still makes resistance statements, but is rather incapable of standing up properly for the Palestinians. Iraq, not able to, it's very weak. Syria now in the hands effectively of Al-Qaeda and hugely balkanized. The Jordanians bought and paid by the Saudis and the US. Nobody really, no country in the region has the wherewithal to stand up for the Palestinians. Not even Turkey, which again makes all kinds of statements, but has relations with Israel. So you really need to open a front with a country turning back to Arab nationalism, lifting the flag of Nasserism once more, a new kind of Nasserism.
Thank you, Vijay. It's been a very, very interesting evening. I'm sure there are many more questions. Some of our friends over here would be disappointed that we don't have time to take up the questions. But I think one must be fair to Vijay also. He's at the other end of the world, and what kind of time zone he is in, I have no idea. But that's how he's used to it. But we also be a little considerate. I think it's been a very good evening. But maybe more of these evenings will be there in the months to come. And we look forward to your continued interaction with us. Thank you all for staying back and watching this and contributing questions. அனைவருக்கும் நன்றி சொல்றோம். ஒரு மிகப்பெரிய கல்விக்கான முயற்சியை துவக்கி இருக்கிறோம். இதை தொடர்வோம் என்று சொல்லி அனைவருக்கும் நன்றி கூறி முடிக்கிறேன். நன்றி. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Good to see you. Take care.
Nice to see you. Bye.
Keep fighting.